For my first blood test in 2022, we saw that my biological age, when using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, and if you're interested in calculating your own biological age, that link will be in the video's description. So when using that calculator, we saw that my biological age was 32.6 years, which was 16.4 years younger than my chronological. Now, prior to 2022, my average reduction for my chronological age minus my biological age over 15 tests was about 12 years. So that's a 4-year further reduction or 4-year further improvement. Similarly, when using aging.ai, we saw that my biological age was 26 years, which is 23 years younger than my chronological age. And prior to 2022, my 27 test average reduction was 16.4 years. So that's a further about 7-year reduction for biological age. So that's my best data over 35 blood tests since 2015. So what about test number 2? So the goal for test number 2 in 2022 was to replicate test number 1's diet to see if that's a major factor driving the improvement in biological age. So the big question is, how well was I able to replicate test number 1's diet for test number 2? So just to refresh everyone's memory, for test number 2 in 2022, I tested about 2 weeks ago, March 14th, and we saw that my biological age was 35.4 years, which is 13.7 years younger than my chronological. Now again, just to refresh everybody's memory, prior to 2022, my average 15 test reduction for biological age was about 12 years. So that's still about 2 years younger than my average reduction for biological age. Similarly, for aging.ai, my predicted age was 28 years, which was 21 years younger than my chronological age of 49. And again, prior to 2022, over 27 tests, my average reduction was 16 years. So that's about a 5-year further reduction. So even though test number 2 biological age data isn't as good as test number 1, both of these two tests are better than my previous chronological age minus biological age average improvements since 2015. So then that raises the question, am I getting closer to the optimal diet for me? Now, everyone may not use this exact macro and micronutrient and food composition for themselves. I can't say what the ideal composition will be for others, but for me, am I getting closer to the optimal diet, thereby optimizing multiple blood biomarkers? So with that in mind, for the focus of this video will be a full comprehensive diet composition, both macro and micronutrients and individual foods for this dietary period when compared with test number 1. So first, let's start with calorie intake as shown there. So again, we're going to compare test number 1's calorie intake versus test number 2. So on the left, we've got the black dots. That's the 42-day period that corresponded to test number 1, and that was December 13th of 2021 through January 23rd of 2022. And for test number 2, it was a 49-day period from January 24th through March 13th of 2022. So for test number 1, my average calorie intake was 22 calories per day. And for test number 2, it was 43 calories per day. And besides looking at the averages for these two dietary periods, we can compare these two groups of data using a 2-sample t-test. And when we do that, we see that these two groups of data are not significantly different, as the p-value is higher than 0.05 with a p-value of 0.08. So from that, we can conclude that there was a similar calorie intake test number 2 when compared with test number 1. So what about macronutrients? So in terms of macronutrients, remember the goal was to replicate test number 1's diet composition for test number 2. And again, although I'm going to show averages for test 1 versus test 2, this isn't just looking at average data, it's comparing the 42-day period that corresponded to test number 1 versus the 49-day period that corresponded to test number 2. So first, let's start with lipids or fat. So we've got blood test number 1 data on the left, and then blood test data for number 2 on the right. So just rounding, we can see that for test number 1, my average fat intake was about 84 grams per day, and it was 83 grams per day for test number 2. And when using the 2-sample t-test, we can see that these two groups of data are not significantly different. So what about the individual fats? So monounsaturated fats, just going down the list, not different. Test 1 versus test 2, about 16 grams per day. Total polyunsaturated fats, not different, about 23 grams per day for both test 1 and test 2. Polyunsaturated fats break down into omega-3 and omega-6. So we can see that my omega-3 was 8 grams versus 8.1 grams, not significantly different. Omega-6, 15.4 versus 15.5, not different. And then saturated fat, identical, 24.4 grams per day for both test number 1 and test number 2. So from this, we can conclude that there was similar levels of total fat and individual fats, including monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, which include omega-3 and omega-6, and also saturated fatty acids, SFA, when comparing test number 2 versus test number 1. Now note that this was not by accident. I purposefully altered my diet each day to try to match test number 1's macronutrients and micronutrients, as we'll see in a minute, for test number 2. So knowing what the macronutrient and micronutrients were for test number 1, every day in Chronometer, I went and looked at my averages for this dietary period that was going to correspond to test number 2. And if I was low in beta carotene or low in fiber, I adjusted my intake to try to get as close as possible to the test number 1 diet composition. And based on the fat so far, it looks like I did a decent job. All right, so what about looking at the other macronutrients, including protein, fiber, sugars, and net carbohydrates? So that's what's shown here. Again, test number 1 data on the left, test number 2 data on the right. So first, looking at protein intake, 102 grams for test number 1, 103 grams per day for test number 2, not different. Fiber intake, about 86 grams for both dietary periods, not different. So in terms of sugars, I track total fructose intake because for me, I have a tendency to eat a lot of fruit. So, and in my data, total fructose, which is defined as fructose plus sucrose divided by 2, as sucrose is half fructose. So I have a tendency to eat a lot of fruit, so I don't want to eat too much fruit sugar, which is what fructose is, because in my data, having relatively higher levels of fructose is significantly correlated with more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So when looking at total fructose for test number 1 versus test number 2, it was 65 grams per day for test 1 versus 62 grams per day for test number 2. And you can see by the p-value, those two groups of data are not different. And then in terms of net carbs, it was about 243 grams per day versus 248. Again, not different. So from this, we can see that I had similar levels of protein, fiber, total fructose, and net carbs when comparing test number 2 data versus test number 1 in 2022. So to summarize that, I had similar levels of all macronutrients for the first test when compared with the second test in 2022. All right, so what about micronutrients? So starting with vitamins, again, test number 1 versus test number 2. And again, this isn't just showing average data and saying they're different. It's comparing the 42-day period that corresponded to test number 1 versus the 49-day period that corresponded to test number 2 using 2 sample t-tests. So instead of going through all of these vitamins and minerals in terms of are they different or not, and again, we've got test 1 data on the left, test 2 data on the right, I'm just going to show all of these that were not different, and that's almost all of the vitamins were not different when comparing data for test number 1 versus test number 2, with the exception of vitamin C. And we can see that for test number 2 it was about 100 milligrams higher for vitamin C in test number 2 versus test number 1. And we'll see why in a minute when we look at food composition. So what about for minerals? Actually, before going to minerals, I should note that let's highlight my B12 intake, which was about 300 micrograms test 1, 318 for test 2. And that's because, as I mentioned in my my most recent video, I supplement with methyl B12 once every 3 days, 1,000 micrograms. So that's why those are significantly higher than the RDA. Note that I've taken that out for the next blood test, so we'll see how that goes. But I also supplement with vitamin D in the winter, so we can see that my D intake was about 1280 IUs per day, and that's because I supplement with 1,000 IUs of vitamin D per day in the winter. As the summer comes up, I take it out. All right, so what about for minerals? Again, test number 1 data on the left, test number 2 data on the right. And again, just going through what was not different, we can see that almost all of these minerals, in terms of average amounts per day, were not different when comparing test number 1 data versus test number 2 data, with the exception of potassium, which was 300 milligrams per day higher. And I didn't purposefully try to increase my potassium. That's likely because of the increased strawberries. All right, so what about differences for food intake? So that's what's shown here, full diet composition, test number 2 versus test number 1. So we've got foods on the left and then ranked in order in terms of the foods that I ate in the highest amounts at the top and at the lowest amounts at the bottom. And then test number 2 data on the left, test number 1 data on the right, and then whether these two groups of data, the 42-day period that corresponded to test number 1 versus the 49-day period for test number 2, whether they were significantly different based on a 2-sample t-test. So I'm just going to highlight what was different. Again, so starting with strawberries, we can see that I ate about 260-ish more grams for test number 2 versus test number 1. And that's because Costco ran out of the 3-berry mix that I usually get. It's a mix of strawberries, blackberries, and blueberries. So they ran out, so I went with strawberries instead. So we'll see in a minute that my blueberry and blackberry intake for this dietary period for test number 2 was 0, whereas strawberries, it was basically replaced by strawberries. So strawberries were the food also that I ate more abundantly than all other foods on the list. All right, also different, but very small differences, but statistically significant. when comparing test number 2 versus test number 1 was watermelon, only 3 grams a day higher though for test number 2 versus test number 1. So that's basically insignificant. Similarly, small but insignificant increases for pickles, 4 grams per day. But then almonds, I increased them by 7 grams per day, in part to get close to my daily goal of vitamin E of 20 milligrams per day. Now note that 15 milligrams is the RDA, and as I'll present in a future video, why I aim for about 20 milligrams per day right now is because having very high vitamin E intakes is correlated with more blood biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So for now, it seems like 20 milligrams per day seems to be good for the biomarkers, so that's the value that I've settled on. All right, then finishing out the remaining foods that I consume for test number 1 and test number 2 and comparing them. So again, looking at differences, so Brazil nuts were a 1/10 of a gram less for test number 2 versus test number 1, and although that's significant statistically, again, that's an insignificant amount. And then we can see that peanuts, I reduced my intake there from 6 to about 0.7 grams per day in test 2. And so I basically replaced almonds for peanuts to get more vitamin E because peanuts don't have as much vitamin E as almonds. And then we can see that 0 intake of blackberry, and blueberry for test 2 versus test 1, which again, Costco ran out. And then note that my diet isn't always perfectly clean. If I'm going to eat junk, I do it on the day of the blood test and the day after, and then I try to shut it down completely. No junk for the remainder of the period until the next blood test. So for test number 1, the junk that I ate on those 2 days was some Nutella, as highlighted there, mixed with peanut butter, so homemade Reese's peanut butter cups. But I also had some pizza as I was traveling on the East Coast, so I figured it was a good time to get some of the world famous East Coast pizza. So we can see that for test number 2, pizza, but not for test number 1, but not for test number 2. And we can also see that I didn't have any Nutella for this blood test, the 49-day period that was in test number 2. And that's because I replaced it with a different version of a homemade Reese's peanut butter cup with milk chocolate bar mixed with M&Ms and also peanut butter. And when looking at the amounts, so that's a 49-day period. So when looking at the amounts of the milk chocolate and M&Ms, that was about 100 grams each over those 2 days for the day of the blood test and the day after. And then I shut it down. There was no junk after that for the next 47 days. And note that approach seems to work for me. For me, I have to completely eliminate it. Otherwise, I'll be thinking about it every week, and I don't want to do that. It's not healthy for me. So note that when looking at full diet composition, my overall diet for test number 2 was very close to test number 1, with the exception of the strawberries, blackberries, and blueberries, and almonds for peanuts. Now, to try to keep biological age better than my recent averages with the test number 1 and test number 2 data, I'm going to try to stick as close as possible to this diet composition going forward. So if I can maintain a greater than 14-year biological age reduction, just using Levine's test as an example, that would be better than a 12-year reduction. And this diet composition may be one contributing factor as to why I had that recent improvement for these 2 tests. So whether that's true, we'll see. I'm going to try to stick to this composition going forward, and we'll see how the biological age results, how they look. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.